If you're natural, should you train like a steroid user? That's the big question. My name is Coach Christian Thibodeau, and this is the first of my new videos for my YouTube channel 2.0. Why 2.0? Because from that point on, I want to put a lot more effort in delivering great content for you guys. And I'm going to have a special treat for you today. It's going to be a full webinar on the differences between training for an enhanced athlete or a natural trainee. And should they be different? Should you take your advice from someone who's been using steroids? And again, a full disclosure, right? At one point in my life, I did use steroids when I was focusing on bodybuilding. However, I actually had most of my biggest lifts before I started taking steroids, except for the bench press, which I was enhanced when I beat my PR, and I got my best physique when it comes to aesthetics and condition without using steroids. I've also trained people from 28 different sports. Most of them were natural, but also competitive bodybuilders from the national level all the way to the Olympia level. So I know what it is to train enhanced. I know what it is to train natural and training enhanced clients. So I know that there are always going to be haters. Oh, that guy is not natty. You know what? If you want to learn to sexually please a woman and a man, you need to ask someone who satisfied both. Not someone who has a lot of theory on how to please women, but only practice pleasing men, or vice versa. So that's what I'm going to offer to you. I'm going to offer you the best about the differences between training natural and training enhanced. So I'm going to equip you with the tools that you're going to be able to use to call the bullshit when it comes to training program and know if they're going to work for you or not. So stay tuned for this completely new webinar. This is promoted by Thibarmy. So follow me on Instagram, Thibarmy, or my website, thibarmy.com. And please hit that subscribe button and also post any comments, question, insult, hate mail. I don't care. Any comment will boost my algorithm, so they're welcome. So let's get it on with the show. So let's first start with the big points we're going to be discussing. Of course, this is just the introduction to tell you where it's going to go from here. So the 5 big points I want to talk about. First, we're going to talk about the cortisol issue. Cortisol is a stress hormone. I'm going to explain exactly what it does, why it's released, how it's released, and how it can hurt the natural trainee, and why the enhanced bodybuilder can actually be somewhat protected from excess cortisol, which makes gaining a lot easier and training a lot more permissive. The second point we're going to be talking about is how steroids reduce the risk of physical overtraining, allowing someone to train a lot more without the possibility of hitting stagnation or even regression. A natural trainee does not have that benefit. He could actually stop his gains by training too much or even lose muscle. I'm going to talk about that in a few moments. Third point will be how steroids can actually reduce what we call neurological overtraining, because steroids we often see them as only tools that will help with muscle recovery and muscle building. In reality, it affects the brain just as much, okay? Steroids will also elevate protein synthesis 24/7, which will be the big thing when we talk about building muscle and physical recovery from training. And finally, we're going to talk about the differences in muscle and tendon strength between both populations. So that will be the one benefit the natural trainee will have over the enhanced trainee, is that the tendon strengthening follows muscle strengthening a bit more, reducing the possible risk of injury from heavy lifting. But for all the other facets, steroid user will have a distinct advantage. And this is not a video to tell you to take steroids. It's a video to tell you that if you take the advice, your training advice from someone who only works with enhanced athletes, or who himself has only trained or built his muscle while being enhanced, there's a good chance that this type of training, it just won't work for you. So you need to understand the differences. And at the end, I will give you a recommendation if you're natural and recommendation if you're enhanced, because I'm pretty sure that we're going to have people from both sides of the fences watching this video. So let's first talk about cortisol. And in every seminar I give, whether it's about performance, strength, hypertrophy, fat loss, I always give that part of the seminar or the webinar, because it's really the most important thing to understand and grasp if you are to properly program a training plan. Understanding cortisol and adrenaline is the key to giving the proper stimulus to your body so that it can actually build itself stronger without risking overtraining, stagnation, or regression. So now this is going to be the really boring part of this webinar. If you can survive the next 15 minutes, you're good to go. Okay, this is going to be like more boring than most of the classes you attended in high school. So bear with me, take a pre-workout, like pause the video, take a pre-workout so that you're going to be fully focused and awake for this portion. But it's actually very important, because if you understand all of that, it's going to make understanding volume, intensity, exercise variation, all that stuff is going to make you understand that a lot more easily, and how you can manipulate those variables to get the best possible results from your training. So first, cortisol. Like most of you who've been training for a while, you know what cortisol is. You've heard about it. It's the stress hormone. If you're someone who's into building muscle, you see it as the catabolic muscle breakdown hormone, but it's actually a lot more than that. In fact, you can't train hard without cortisol. So it's really important to understand that it's not the enemy, but excess cortisol can become the enemy. So you need to control it and manipulate it to optimize your result. Most people call it the stress hormone because it's released during stressful situation. I prefer to call it the operational availability hormone, or the readiness hormone. Basically, cortisol makes sure that regardless of the stressful situation you are in, you might fight a tiger, run away from a tiger, you might be stuck under a big squat, whatever the stress is, cortisol makes sure that you have all the resources so that your brain, muscle, lungs, heart will be functioning at their maximum capacity to make sure that you have the greatest possible chance of success while facing that stress. Okay, so the way it works basically is, first, when you have a potentially dangerous or stressful situation, could be physical stress, could be psychological stress, could be any form of stressor really, you will release a hormone, a neurotransmitter called noradrenaline. Okay, noradrenaline or norepinephrine is first released, and that will increase focus, awareness, to allow you to, or allow your brain to decide if that potential danger is a real danger. If it is decided that the stress is high enough to put you in alert mode, then you will release cortisol. The noradrenaline will force the body to release cortisol, and cortisol itself will release another neurotransmitter called adrenaline. And adrenaline will increase focus, will increase muscle strength, will increase speed, will increase competitiveness, will increase confidence to make you capable of facing that stress. It also makes you more aggressive. That's really important to understand. So let's look at the functions of cortisol. It's often seen as a bad hormone because one of its effects is that it can possibly lead to muscle loss or slow down muscle gain. We're going to get to that later. But it's actually important because without it, you simply cannot train hard. You cannot do anything physical or mental at a high level of performance. You need cortisol to be put in a state where you're going to be able to perform regardless of the task, okay? So the first 5 functions of cortisol are: first, it will increase mental awareness. It increases motivation and drive and focus by increasing adrenaline level. So basically, you release noradrenaline or norepinephrine when there's a potential stress situation going on. Then you release cortisol if it's a real stress, and the cortisol will increase the conversion of noradrenaline into adrenaline. So it's the adrenaline that makes you more driven, more motivated, more focused, but it's actually released mostly by cortisol. So without cortisol, you're actually going to be sluggish. You're going to have low energy, low drive, okay? Second function, it will increase the heart rate. It will increase the contraction strength of your heart, contraction strength of your muscle, and also increase speed and coordination. So it makes you better at sending oxygen to the muscle, giving you better endurance, but it also increases your strength, speed, and power potential so you can perform better. And that is done because of adrenaline. Essentially, you have receptors called the beta-adrenergic receptors that are on many tissues: muscle, heart, blood vessel, kidneys, brain, whatever, and they interact with adrenaline. Adrenaline binds to the beta-adrenergic receptors so that adrenaline can do its job as an excitatory neurotransmitter. It excites you. If it excites the muscle, they contract harder. If it excites the brain, you're thinking faster, and so on and so forth. If it excites the heart, it beats faster and more strongly to send more blood to the muscle, more oxygen to the muscle. So as you can see, without cortisol and adrenaline, it's kind of hard to perform physically and mentally. Third function, it mobilizes stores of energy. It breaks down glycogen stored in the muscle. It breaks down fatty acids stored as body fat. And it also breaks down muscle tissue into amino acid. The goal is simply to make sure that you don't run out of fuel while you're facing that enemy. The last thing your body wants is, if you're fighting a tiger or running away for your life, you don't want to run out of fuel midway to the action because you're going to die. So the body releases cortisol so that breaks down stored energy so that you never run out of fuel. The side effect is that this can potentially make you lose muscle because you break it down. But honestly, only chronically elevated cortisol levels can do that. I mean, if you have a spike in cortisol during the training and it comes back down to normal afterwards, that's not going to be a problem. The problem is, as we will see later, if it's always elevated or it's elevated too much, now we're going to have a problem making muscle growth much harder and more likely that you're actually going to lose muscle. So cortisol is actually a fat loss hormone. Well, tip. Now, I've done like biosignature or metabolic analytics, and they say that cortisol increases abdominal fat, or high abdominal fat is a sign of high cortisol. How could that be if it's a fat loss hormone? I'm going to get to that in about 5 minutes when I'm going to talk about the problems with chronically elevated cortisol. Because cortisol is indeed something that makes you lose fat by mobilizing stored energy. But if it becomes chronically elevated, it can actually make you gain fat. That paradox is going to be explained shortly, so bear with me. So it mobilizes stored energy, which also makes it harder to keep your muscles full if cortisol is always high. Because if cortisol is always high, I'm always breaking down muscle glycogen. Kind of hard to replenish glycogen stores after your training and keep that muscle full looking and full feeling. Okay, it will also increase blood sugar level if it becomes too low. If blood sugar level dips down too low, you release cortisol and growth hormone to break down stored glycogen, increasing blood sugar level. If it's too high, it releases insulin. The body wants stable blood sugar level. By the way, that's one of the reasons why a keto diet or intermittent fasting is not optimal to build muscle. Now, cue in the haters. If you want to post your comment, that's actually going to help me, because more interaction means more YouTube recommendations. So please, haters, let me know how much I suck. But the reality is that if you go low carbs or very low calories, or if you are intermittent fasting for 16, 18 hours, during that period, you will pump out cortisol like crazy. Why? Because if you're not giving carbs to your body, blood sugar level goes down, especially if you're physically active. So the body's response will be to break down stored glycogen to increase blood sugar level, and even break down stored muscle as amino acids, so you can turn those amino acids into glucose to maintain a stable blood sugar level. So these diets make it a lot harder to build muscle. It's not impossible. As Eric Bach mentioned, it is possible to build muscle on a keto diet, but it's also possible to go from New York to Los Angeles by foot. But it's not the most efficient solution. That's all I'm saying. All right. So, fifth function of cortisol, it inhibits the immune system, because cortisol is the readiness hormone. It puts the emphasis on the systems that you need to face a danger or a stress, right? So it's kind of like, okay, slight revelation here. When I was younger, I was a big Star Trek fan, which explains why I was a virgin until I was 22 years old, right? So in Star Trek, for example, let's say that the Enterprise was being attacked by Romulans. Then the captain would say something like, divert all energy to the deflector shields, because you wanted to have as much resources as possible to protect you against the enemy. That's what cortisol does. It takes out the energy for the systems you don't need right now. Okay, the body doesn't care that you have a cold if you're about to be eaten by a tiger. So it will bring down the immune system to send more resources to your muscles, your brain, your heart, your lungs, so you can actually face the enemy. What happens is, after you're done fighting the enemy, cortisol goes back down, immune system goes back up, and the immune system initiates the repair process. That's how it works. Okay, so these are the roles of cortisol, and they are necessary to properly train hard and be functional in your everyday life. The problem becomes when cortisol levels are chronically elevated, which happens a lot in our modern lifestyle. We always have to go fast. We have lots of stress at work, financial issue, relationship problems, stuff like that. That is stress. The body does not differentiate between the psychological stress, a physical stress, an environmental stress. So any stressor will actually release cortisol. And that becomes a problem when cortisol is always elevated, because now the problem will show. And here are a few of the problems. First, well, if you look at the table here, the first two ones explain why chronically elevated cortisol can make it harder to build muscle and more likely that you're going to actually lose muscle. Okay. People who lose muscle, for example, when dieting down, they lose muscle not because they lack calories. They lose muscle because they have excess cortisol from the low calories. Because when calories are low, well, you probably also have low carbs. So the body needs to mobilize stored energy, releasing cortisol in the process. So that can actually lead to losing muscle, especially if you train too much or do too much conditioning work. Then that just piles on, and that releases even more cortisol, and you're gonna have a problem. That's a big problem, by the way, with people who diet down naturally. They have the tendency to increase training volume because they want to use the lifting session to cut up those muscles. Well, you know what? That is the best, the absolute best way to lose muscle when dieting. You need to train hard, but with a lower volume, because you want to minimize cortisol, which will already be elevated from the reduced calories, reduced carbs. All right. So cortisol will make you more likely to lose muscle or harder to build muscle. First, by increasing levels of myostatin. Myostatin is a myokine. A myokine is a cool word you can use. Well, if we are ever allowed to go clubbing again, you can just use dude, do you know what a myokine is? I guarantee that you look like the smartest dude there, and all the girls will flock to you. Anyway, so a myokine is actually a protein released by the muscle. And what it does is, well, it signals your body to stop building muscle. The more myostatin you release, the less muscle your body will allow you to build, okay? So cortisol, by increasing myostatin, make it harder to build muscle. Lower cortisol, lower myostatin, you build more muscle. That's one of the reasons why, well, you know, if you are a professional bodybuilder, making a living just by training and doing only fan accounts, well, you don't have that much stress in your life. You have lower myostatin. It's easier to build muscle. Same thing if you're a professional athlete. You know, these guys obviously work hard. They have good genetics. But the fact that you can devote your life to training and you don't have financial stress or job issues actually make it easier to gain. You still have to put the work in, but you can actually tolerate and recover and build from that work a lot easier. All right. It also increases muscle degradation. As we saw earlier, cortisol breaks down muscle tissue. If it becomes chronically elevated, so it's always slightly high, well, you are always breaking down tissue at a slightly faster pace than usual, making it harder to net muscle growth. Okay, so that's for muscle growth. Then it also reduces resynthesis of glycogen. Well, when you train, you burn muscle glycogen. You need to replenish that to have more fuel for your future workout and also to look jacked. Because, well, a muscle is like a water balloon. If you empty the balloon from the water, it just looks small and deflated. Same thing with your muscles. If you empty the water and glycogen and glucose from the muscle, they look small and deflated. So if you don't replenish glycogen, it's going to be hard to train harder to train with high intensity. You're going to look smaller. You're actually going to look fatter because your muscles will look softer and they won't push against the skin as much. So not a good mix, right? You're also going to have more problem with mind-muscle connection. So a flat muscle, you have a harder time feeling it when you're training, which can be very demoralizing when you're training. Okay, now, it can also lead to lowered testosterone and estrogen. So that can actually hurt muscle growth too, because testosterone is the anabolic hormone. If you're injecting 2 grams of test a week, that probably doesn't matter. But if you're natural, you don't want to plummet your testosterone levels. And even estrogen in women, estrogen is actually anabolic because estrogen increases IGF-1 that can palliate for the lower testosterone level, helping women build muscle. So testosterone and estrogen, like cortisol, are made from pregnenolone, which is another hormone. If you produce too much cortisol, I'm using a lot of pregnenolone, leaving less to build testosterone and estrogen, and over time, it can lead to lower levels of sex hormone. In fact, one of the best signs of chronically elevated cortisol level is low sex drive. Men, especially the loss of morning wood, for example, is a pretty good barometer for excess stress levels or excess cortisol levels. Okay. Now, we talked about how cortisol is a fat loss hormone, even though it can actually lead to fat gain. How is that? Well, the 2 reasons. The first reason is when cortisol is chronically elevated, always high, it signals the body to reduce the conversion of T4 to T3. I lost 50% of the viewers with that simple comment. Let me try to bring them back in. Okay, you have several thyroid hormones, T4, T3 being the 2 main ones. The body produces mostly T4, which is largely inactive when it comes to metabolic rate, for example. T3, on the other hand, is the hormone that has the greatest impact on metabolic rate. How much energy your body is burning day in and day out, even without doing anything. The higher your metabolic rate is, the more calories, the more fuel you burn, the easier it is to lose fat, and the harder it is to gain fat. Well, if I'm reducing the conversion of T4 to T3, my metabolic rate goes down. And that's what cortisol does. If it's always high, it signals the body to decrease that conversion. It's a survival mechanism because in nature, when we were cavemen, the only situation where you had chronically elevated cortisol levels was if you were deprived of food for too long. Think about it. If I'm facing a tiger, cortisol spikes very high, but after the fight, it goes back down. Then I'm going to eat the tiger, plenty of food, plenty of calories, cortisol goes way down. I'm good to go. If I'm running away from a tiger, same thing, big spike in cortisol to increase adrenaline, then it goes down once I'm. If he hits me and I die, it goes even lower because I stop producing hormones altogether. Now, the only situation when we were cavemen, when cortisol was always high, is if we were deprived of food. Because remember, cortisol mobilized stored energy. So if you had to rely on your energy stores for a while, you lived with high cortisol level. And that signals the body to decrease metabolic rate to increase your chance of survival. So if someone has chronically elevated cortisol level, but still eats normally or even a surplus, well, it's going to be really hard to lose fat because, well, your metabolic rate will go down while your caloric intakes doesn't match that up, right? Now, it also reduces insulin sensitivity. So too much cortisol will make you less sensitive to insulin. I'm not going to get into all the insulin sensitivity debate because that's like 2 hours and most of you are bored to death right now. But just take my word for it. Excess cortisol, when it's chronically elevated, will lead eventually to insulin sensitivity, which makes it slightly harder to lose fat. You're not going to store more fat if you're resistant to insulin, but it's going to be much harder to lose it. Anyway, it also creates water retention. Now, water retention is one of the best signs of excess cortisol. You can actually see that after a workout. If your training load, your workload, the amount of stress you impose on your body during the workout was excessive, there's a good chance that 1 or 2 hours after the session, you actually feel more bloated and you look less defined than you did at the beginning of the session because of extracellular or under the skin water retention. Cortisol increases the two hormones responsible for water retention, aldosterone, vasopressin, or antidiuretic hormone. Now, if a client of mine, for example, suddenly seems to gain 5 pounds in a matter of days without changing their diet, 9 times out of 10, it's a cortisol spike leading to water retention. When I fly to give a seminar, well, when I flew because of COVID, right? And I had a long flight because of the stress of traveling. When I get home the next day, I routinely gain up to 11 pounds in water retention simply from the increase in those hormone that makes you retain water. If you're competing in bodybuilding, that's why cortisol is the #1 reason for missed peaks. It's not because you didn't use the most magical diuretic or you didn't use the up-to-date carb loading strategy that all the pros use. The reason why you miss your peak is because you're stressed about missing your peak. So you elevate cortisol. If you elevate cortisol, you don't store muscle glycogen. If you elevate cortisol, you retain water. So muscles are flat and you retain water, you look like shit, right? So that's what cortisol does. Anyway, the other functions impact, it can lead to beta-adrenergic desensitization. We're going to get to that in a moment. Because if you produce too much cortisol, you also produce too much adrenaline. That's why you have problems sleeping when you're under stress, because cortisol increases adrenaline. Try taking a shot of adrenaline and going to bed. Good luck, right? So if you're chronically under stress, adrenaline is also high, which makes you more likely to take those adrenaline receptors and making them resistant to your own adrenaline, which is what overtraining really is. Back to that in a second, all right? Then you're going to have an impact on methylation cycle and glutamate production, which I'm not going to get into because even myself, I will like bore even myself by talking about that, right? So now I did cover the most like scientific or complex topic, but I still need to tie that in to training and then tie that in the differences between natural and enhanced, right? Because that's why you're here for, right? So I'm going to talk briefly about what we often call adrenal fatigue, which doesn't exist. It's just a bad term altogether, or neurological fatigue, overtraining, or what I personally use, training burnout, because that more properly describe what is going on. But the symptoms are the same regardless of the term you're using. You have decreased energy, loss of motivation, apathy, basically you stop caring about anything, anhedonia, nothing gives you pleasure. You could win the lottery and just be, all right, cool. You wouldn't be happy. Anhedonia, right? Decreased sex drive or libido. Talked about that earlier. Depression even. Loss of confidence and self-esteem. Decreased performance, physical and mental. Decreased focus, concentration, or memory. Okay, these symptoms are real. They are associated with many call adrenal fatigue, which doesn't exist, or neurological fatigue, CNS fatigue, which is a limited description of what's going on, or what I call training burnout, what many people call overtraining. Those symptoms, in most cases, are due to a downregulation of the beta-adrenergic receptors. This is a sentence where every single word except of is not easily understandable. Therefore, it's really important that you understand it so that you will be smarter than everybody else in a room. So downregulation means that your receptors stop responding or have a lower response to a hormone or neurotransmitter. Beta-adrenergic refers to receptor interacting with adrenaline. Adrenergic, adrenaline, and receptors are receptors. So basically what happens is you overstimulate those receptors by constantly always bombarding them with adrenaline because of too much cortisol. Now, not every, but most receptors in your body can be downregulated. Two of them downregulate much more easily than others. Insulin receptors and beta-adrenergic receptors. Because in both cases, it's a life or death thing. And if you flood your body with excess testosterone, you're not going to die right now. In the long run, because of the elevation in blood pressure, maybe a bit more kidney stress. Because of that, it could lead to cardiovascular issues down the road. But you're not going to die the day after injecting a gram of testosterone. But if you overstimulate your beta-adrenergic receptors, you could actually die. People overdosing on speeds. People actually dying from energy drinks overload while also playing ice hockey afterwards, for example. Because if adrenaline activity is too high, your heart rate goes through the roof, and that can actually lead to a heart attack. So the body, to protect itself against overstimulation, made those receptors very easy to downregulate. In as little as 1 day of overstimulation, they can actually be downregulated for a few days. A recent study conducted on an overtraining protocol, basically training like the Bulgarian Olympic weightlifters, maxing out 5 days a week. In 2 weeks, the lifters had an average of 37% downregulation of those receptors. Very easy to downregulate. Ask any bodybuilder who has used clenbuterol. The first day they use it, they have the jitters, they can't sleep, they feel like they're on speed. 2 or 3 days afterward, it's like they're not taking anything. They have to increase their dosage. Or they have to stop after 10 days because they don't feel anything. That's because they target the beta-adrenergic receptors and they downregulate almost instantly. Anyway, and also ask a bodybuilder who suddenly stopped taking clenbuterol, or, well, let me rephrase that. Ask a bikini girl what it's like to stop taking clenbuterol, because these are the clenbuterol's junkie. Anyway, they will be depressive, almost suicidal. Why? Because they downregulated their beta-adrenergic receptors and they don't produce enough adrenaline to be able to get going. Go back to the previous slide. No motivation, no drive, apathy, anhedonia. They feel like shit, right? That's what happens when you downregulate those receptors. And that leads to lack of performance and stuff like that. Now, you can take that up even further if you can continue trying to produce more adrenaline by increasing cortisol. You can deplete noradrenaline, which will lead to all the previous symptoms, but also lack of focus, lack of concentration. You will be losing your keys all the time. You walk into a room and you forget why you were there. You are in the middle of a conversation and you suddenly don't know what you are talking about. Essentially, you become Joe Biden. Right? So that's a political joke, right? Ooh, dangerous, right? So that's level 2. And level 3, you can actually deplete dopamine. Then zero motivation, and that's when depression occurs. Why could these all 3 can happen? Because adrenaline is made from noradrenaline. So if you overproduce adrenaline, you can actually deplete noradrenaline by taking too much of it to produce the adrenaline. And noradrenaline is made from dopamine. So you can also lead to a dopamine depletion. Anyway, that's what we call training burnout, overtraining, and overall feeling like shit. And it's simply due to producing too much cortisol, leading to an excess production of adrenaline. That's the problem. Now, what is the connection with our topic at hand? Well, I'm glad you asked. Well, maybe you didn't ask, but I in my head, like, Tim, what does that have to do with naturally enhanced training? Well, it's because enhanced trainees will be somewhat protected from cortisol. We'll get to that later, right? But for the moment, understand how training impacts cortisol. Because if you understand that, you can understand how to manipulate it more easily. You have 6 variables that can increase cortisol in training. First, you have volume. That is probably the most important training variable that will impact cortisol. Because one of the functions of cortisol is to mobilize stored energy. The more volume you do, the more energy you need. So if you need more energy, you produce more cortisol. So the higher volume increases cortisol more than low volume. The second variable that will increase cortisol is intensiveness, not intensity. Intensiveness means how hard you are pushing each set. Going to complete muscle failure will produce, scientific term, a shitload more cortisol than if you stop even just 2 reps short. That's not even comparable, right? The closer you get to failure, the more your body feels like it's about to be crushed by an enemy because it doesn't know you're trying to lift a barbell to build bigger chest. It only knows there's a big weight trying to crush you, and if you don't lift it, you're going to die. And in those last few reps, it actually feels like you won't be able to lift it. The body, to survive, will pump out cortisol like crazy, so you get an adrenaline boost to be able to finish that lift, right? So going to failure, a lot more stressful than stopping 2 or even 1 rep short, right? Now, these are the 2 most important variables when it comes to cortisol. And that's going to be important to understand because if you're natural, you can only emphasize 1 at a time. If you have high volume in a session and high intensiveness in a session, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot because you're going to produce too much cortisol for you to be able to recover, right? Enhanced bodybuilder can actually tolerate that. Then you have psychological stress. Psychological stress is if you're nervous about a task. Let's say I had a brain fart period. Well, you know, when you're married, you make sacrifices to like keep your wife happy so you can actually do things on your own. Anyway, so for about a month and a half, I did CrossFit with my wife. That bought me like 3 years worth of goodies. Anyway, every workout, driving in my car to the box, I actually had high heart rate and I was nervous because I didn't know what to expect. I knew it would be hard and it would suck and it would be painful. So that is actually increasing cortisol because the body knows there's something dangerous coming up. So it prepares your body in advance. The increase in heart rate is the #1 tell sign that adrenaline is elevated. And if adrenaline is elevated, it means cortisol was pumped out first. It could also be, I'm looking at a bar, 500 pounds in a bar, never squatted that before. I'm pacing back and forth like a caged tiger. I'm slapping myself in the face a few times. I'm grabbing that bar like I want to kill it. I get under it and I unrack it and boom, easy, right? Well, it was easy because of all that drama before, elevated cortisol because I was anxious about that lift, which led to an increase in adrenaline, making me stronger, okay? And what always happens afterwards, I'm going to try 10 more pounds. But by now, your confidence is high. I'm going to nail this. You don't get the same adrenaline boost, and you fail the lift. You never beat 2 PRs on the same lift on the same day ever. Don't try it. It's stupid. Right. So psychological stress, you know it's going to suffer. You know it's something you've never done before. You're insecure. That will increase cortisol and adrenaline. Neurological stress. The more complex an exercise or a method is, the more brain power you need. And remember, adrenaline does not only turn on the muscle, it turns on the brain. So you need adrenaline to make your brain in that state to be able to do complex tasks, which requires cortisol. So if I'm doing the Olympic lifts, I'm going to get more adrenaline, more cortisol if I'm doing barbell curls, especially if I've never done the Olympic lifts before. If I'm trying a new movements I've never done before, it will also increase adrenaline more. If I'm doing giant sets or circuits, I have more exercises in a row. That requires more brain power because I need to focus on one, then immediately switch my focus on the second one. That requires more brain activation. It speeds me up. It gives me better workout performance because it activates the nervous system, but it also leads to more cortisol. You need to take that into consideration. Here's a little tip. When you introduce new exercises or movements you've never done a lot before, you're not comfortable with, decrease the training volume for a while, just to make sure that you don't reach an excess cortisol. Because not a single one of these variables by itself will be problematic. It's when the total stress of the session by a combination of these 6 variables is too high that you're going to have problems. You can have very high volume, but don't push the intensiveness too high. Keep exercise you're comfortable with. Don't attempt PR. Use mostly machines over free weights. You're going to be fine because you're increasing cortisol or stress with one variable, but you're decreasing all the other variables. That is tolerable. Especially if you're natural, you cannot have too much stress in one session. All right. So high training density, short rest intervals will also increase adrenaline, thus cortisol. Competitiveness, trying to beat your records, trying to beat your partner, also increase cortisol. They are basically in order of their impact on cortisol, with 1, 2, and 3 being the 2 big ones. So they are the ones going to be able to manipulate the most if you want to make sure cortisol level is not too high while still getting a stimulation that will lead to growth. Now, let's go back to our topic at hand, the differences between natural and enhanced. The first one, muscle repair. Big advantage to steroid users. Why? Because of a thing called protein synthesis. And that's basically the main mechanisms of anabolic steroids is they increase protein synthesis. So as long as the steroid is in your body, you're going to have elevated protein synthesis. And elevated protein synthesis means you are storing more muscle tissue than you are breaking down, leading eventually to an increase in muscle mass. A natural trainee, when he lifts, he's going to increase protein synthesis in that muscle for at most 36 hours. And even at 36 hours, it's like by 5%. But a significant increase is around 24 to 30 hours post-workout. It can actually peak at like it's double what it normally would be at 24 hours, and it slowly comes back down. And by 36, it's back to normal. So essentially, after a workout, you have 1 day and a half where you are building muscle at an increased rate. Afterwards, protein synthesis comes back down and becomes even with protein breakdown. And at that point, it's very, very hard to build muscle. Whereas with the enhanced bodybuilder, it's always here. Okay, depending on your doses, it can actually be here, which means that you can actually build muscle 24/7. That gives you a big advantage. Now, the big thing here to understand is that natural trainees oftentimes shoot themselves in the foot by doing too much muscle damage. Okay, if I'm looking at a program of a pro bodybuilder, he's doing 20, 30 sets, all to failures, sometimes drop sets, crazy workout, tons of muscle damage. Here's the thing. Because his anabolic processes are elevated 24/7, he can actually repair that muscle tissue and build over it fairly easily. Because even if after 36 hours, the damage has not been repaired, not a problem. He still has elevated protein synthesis. He's going to be able to build that muscle. However, the natural trainee, after that 36 hours window is over, protein synthesis comes back down, balance would break down, very hard to build muscle. If you produce too much muscle damage, so that after, let's say, 36 hours, you barely repair the damage you caused during the session, you're not going to be able to build a lot of muscle because you don't have time to build more muscle on top of the repair you did. If after 36 hours, you have not even repaired all that damage, it's even worse, you will lose muscle tissue, or you're likely to lose muscle tissue. So you need to create muscle damage enough to force the body to repair and build stronger. But if you create too much damage, you will actually regress or stagnate. So that's the first difference between natural and enhanced. Enhanced lifters can repair damaged tissue and add muscle tissue without any time constraint, whereas natural lifters, they need to do the right amount of work. So by 36 hours, they've repaired and added muscle tissue. Now, for example, okay, I've devoted the past 5 months to golf. That's something people don't know about me. I used to be a competitive golfer when I was younger, and I got back into it this summer. I actually stopped training hard for a while to regain mobility and be able to do my full swing. Not because I was huge or anything, but I have very short arms. I'm barrel-chested, so mobility was an issue. My body was interfering with proper body positions. So I started training hard again, and I'm actually, after my chest session, the day after, I was sore, and 2 days after, my chest was fuller and looked a bit bigger. I did my back the day after. 2 days later, my traps and back were popping up more. And that's actually what should happen, because normally a natural trainee, after 36 hours, you should have added muscle. It's not going to be 2 pounds of muscle, but the process lasts 36 hours. If you've not added a small amount of muscle tissue from your session after 36 hours, you're not going to be adding anything. If you train too much, and if after 2 days, let's say 2 days after your session, if your trained muscle actually feels smaller and flatter, you did too much. Pretty easy, right? Okay. So obviously, the advanced athlete can tolerate more volume, can tolerate more advanced method causing damage than the natural trainee, right? That's one of the reasons why you can't train the same. Second reason, cortisol impacts, natural versus enhanced. Cortisol can be the greatest enemy of the natural trainee because it can actually interfere with muscle growth. And if you do too much, cortisol is elevated too much, and it will increase myostatin. It will increase protein breakdown, making it harder to build more muscle tissue. With an enhanced lifter, you have some form of protection for 3 main reasons. First, because anabolic steroids will increase protein synthesis so much that even if cortisol increases, let's say that's breakdown, that's protein synthesis, the bigger the difference between both, the more muscle you're going to be building. Now, even if cortisol increases protein breakdown, if your steroids take you here, you still have a big gap. If you're natural, your training session brings you here, but you bring cortisol here, you're not going to be building that much muscle, right? By increasing protein synthesis, it's much easier to have a positive anabolic versus catabolic balance, okay? Second reason, at the cellular level, your muscle cell, the way hormone, testosterone and cortisol works is that they bind to a receptor, then there's a message being sent from the receptor site to the nucleus of the muscle cell. If testosterone binds to the androgen receptors, it sends a message to the cell, it increases protein synthesis, you build muscle. If cortisol binds to the glucocorticoid receptors, it sends a message to increase protein breakdown, you lose muscle. Now, the thing is that both hormones use the same transporter to go from the receptor to the nucleus. It's called a second messenger, okay? If you overload your cell by so much steroid androgens that you basically overload all those androgen receptors, you're going to use all those second messengers, leaving very little for cortisol. So you're actually lowering cortisol activity at the muscle cell by overloading anabolic steroids. That's great while you are on cycle, but that can actually be devastating after a cycle. I'm going to get to that later on. Okay, but for now, understand that it actually decreases the activity of cortisol at the muscle level, allowing you to build more muscle. Now, certain steroids actually directly block the action of cortisol or decrease its release. Dynamol and allotestin are well known for that. That's why, for example, allotestin is used by bodybuilders to peak for a competition. Okay, the reason is that allotestin has two impacts. First, it will decrease the binding of cortisol to the receptors, which will decrease by extension water retention. Remember, cortisol increases water retention. The lower cortisol is, the less water you retain. So that will make you drier. But allotestin is so androgenic that, and we will get to that in a moment, it increases the sensitivity of your beta-adrenergic receptors. The more androgenic the product is, the more you make those beta-adrenergic receptors sensitive. So you respond more adrenaline to adrenaline that increases muscle tone, making you look harder, okay? By the way, that's one of the reasons why lots of bodybuilders are also rave addicts, or they become addict to speeds, amphetamines, stuff like that, because the steroids increase their reactivity to those substances which target the beta-adrenergic receptors. Anyway, I'm going to get to that in a moment. So these three reasons, and by the way, like Dynamol will make you feel better because it targets both the dopamine receptors, the pleasure neurotransmitter, and also it decreases cortisol, which brings adrenaline down, so you're more chill, more relaxed. Whereas allotestin will actually make you more aggressive. Okay, back to that in a moment. So the big difference here is that steroid users can grow much better than natural trainees when they have high cortisol, either because of excessive training or because of life stress. So again, that means that if you're natural, especially if you have a busy lifestyle, you can't look at a program of a steroid user and say, well, I'm going to use that and it's going to work. Because people have this conception that the steroids build muscle. So maybe that bodybuilder using steroids gain 10 pounds on this program. I'm natural. I'm probably going to gain only 5 pounds, but it's still going to work. That doesn't work like that. The program can actually make you lose muscle or at the very least not gain any muscle at all if it's excessive in cortisol, and it will make you feel like shit because of the possible training burnout. Okay? So remember the 6 training variables. Enhanced lifters can tolerate a higher level of these variables, whereas natural trainees need to find 1 or 2 that they want to focus on and bring the others down to make sure the overall stress of the session is not excessive. Neurological fatigue, training burnout, being able to avoid feeling like crap, natural versus enhanced. Like for a long time, people believe that steroids only help lifters build muscle faster. In reality, it also helps with the nervous system. For example, steroids will increase the sensitivity of the beta-adrenergic receptors. Remember, the beta-adrenergic receptors are the receptors that interact with adrenaline, and the more sensitive you are, the more you respond to adrenaline when it's released. So people with more sensitive beta-adrenergic receptors, first, they will be more aggressive, more competitive. By the way, when we talk about roid rage, that's what it is. Some steroids increase the sensitivity of the beta-adrenergic receptors, and one of the effects of being stimulated by adrenaline is that it makes you more aggressive. Why? Because adrenaline is the fight or flight neurotransmitter, okay? And being aggressive increase your chances of winning a fight, okay? So being more competitive, being more aggressive, being more confident is an effect of high adrenaline. If you make your receptors more responsive to adrenaline, you get triggered by adrenaline a lot more easily, okay? So that can lead to roid rage, or at the very least being less patient in some individual. Because if some individual have naturally low response to adrenaline, even if you increase it a bit more, they still going to be normal. If someone is already here and you increase the sensitivity to here, the slightest adrenaline release will turn them into aggressive beast, okay? But the other side of that is that, remember, what I call training burnout, overtraining, is desensitization of the receptors. Steroids, by increasing the sensitivity, can counteract that. You're less likely to get desensitized because steroids make you more sensitive. Okay, that's why you can tolerate more high adrenaline activities. Some steroids also stimulate the dopamine receptors. Dianabol, for example, testosterone. They actually trigger a dopamine response. Pleasure neurotransmitter, alpha male neurotransmitter, confidence neurotransmitter, motivation neurotransmitter. Gives you that Superman feeling. So that boost in confidence and competitiveness gives you an advantage when it comes to training and competing. That's why you have athletes saying, well, I'm not in a sport where you need muscle, yet they are like caught using steroids. Why? Because they actually help from a neurological perspective. You don't need to build muscle for steroids to help you perform better. It gives you an unfair advantage whether you want to use them to build muscle or not. Now, as I explained, the main mechanism training burnout is the desensitization. By increasing the sensitivity, steroids can help you balance that. Certain steroids, as we saw earlier, will also lower cortisol or lower the binding effect of cortisol, which still allows you to repair more muscle damage, allowing you to do more volume without overtraining. And also by decreasing adrenaline, because remember, cortisol leads to the release of adrenaline. So if you decrease cortisol activity, you can also decrease adrenaline. If you decrease adrenaline, you have less chance of desensitizing those receptors, because receptors desensitize when they are overstimulated. So these are mechanisms that can actually protect a steroid user from neurological fatigue. I'm not saying they can't reach it, but they are less prone than natural trainee. So enhanced lifters are also able to do more neurologically demanding work before suffering training burnout. There's a downside to that I will cover in a moment. By the way, here's another topic I want to discuss very briefly. Some steroids, as I mentioned, they target the dopamine receptors, giving you a sense of well-being, of being powerful, of being strong, being more motivated. The problem is that when you stop your cycle, those receptors are used to being stimulated by a lot of substances increasing dopamine activity. When you take those drugs out, your receptors are not getting what they're used to. So your own natural dopamine is no longer enough. You suffer from withdrawal. So you're actually going to be exhibiting symptoms of the same symptoms like a drug addict who stops using drugs. There's a real psychological, neurological dependency to steroids. And when you stop stimulating those dopamine receptors, that's what leads to depression after a cycle. You need to understand that. So there's always downsides. It's not just about health problem down the line. There are problems right now. Okay, tendons. Well, the big problem, that's the one point where natural trainees are at an advantage. Steroids will increase muscular development and strength faster than tendons can adapt. The reason is, well, because of the protein synthesis, muscles are built so much faster, and because of the increase in beta-adrenergic sensitivity and the dopamine stimulation, strength increases very fast. You will have a lifter start taking steroids, like let's say he's taking an oral steroid, let's say allotestin or anavar or turinabol, and the first day they're stronger. They have not built any muscle in one day. The reason is that they have increased the sensitivity of their receptors. It's even worse with trenbolone. Trenbolone user will get stronger the first day because it's so androgenic that it increased beta sensitivity, and that will make them respond a lot more to adrenaline, increasing strength and power a lot more. But here's the thing is, you increase strength so much faster than your tendons can carry that you risk the injury to your tendons and muscles. Whereas with natural trainees, tendons still adapt slower than muscles, but the difference is not as important. So the chance of injury from an imbalance is much less likely. On top of that, you will argue, because literature shows that some steroids actually increases tendon repair by increasing collagen production. Tendons are made mostly of collagen. You need that to make those tendons stronger. And some steroids increase collagen production. The problem is that it actually leads to what is called collagen dysplasia. Collagen dysplasia means that you are not organizing collagen properly in the collagen fibers or the fibrils. So it actually leads to tendons that is more brittle, even though you are repairing it. And steroids do that. It's well documented. So even if you are rebuilding those tendons, you're not rebuilding them properly, so they are more likely to be getting injured. Okay. Now, enhanced lifters tend to be more at risk of tendon and muscle injuries when they are trying to push their strength up as fast as possible. Yeah, but Christian, all those strongmen and powerlifters are on steroids. Why are they still able to lift? Well, first, go ask a high-level powerlifter and ask him about his injury history. You'll be flabbergasted at how many injuries most of them have. But these guys, those who are able to reach the top level in strongman and powerlifting, are normally structurally built to be strong. So they naturally have bigger bone structures, naturally have thicker tendons. So for a while, it can actually compensate for the dramatic strength increase. But the average lifter, especially the lifter who thinks he's Superman when taking steroids, if he tries to lift too heavy too often, it can lead to injury. Whereas the natural trainees, well, even though he's not protected 100% from injuries, it's still less likely to happen than for a steroid user. So take-home message. Enhanced lifters can not only get away with bad programming, they can actually benefit from doing too much volume when it comes to a natural training. So you can look at a very successful bodybuilder using steroids, and if you apply the same program, what is optimal for him might actually be destructive for you. You need to keep that in mind and analyze the program objectively. If you have 20, 30 sets per body part, taking close to failure, there is no way a natural trainee can recover from that. Okay. Now, they are more at risk of injuries. I mentioned that. Now, if you look at natural lifters, so 4 takeaways. Natural lifters will need a lower daily training stress. That doesn't mean you should not train hard. It means that you cannot take all those 6 variables to a very high level. If you want to do volume, which is fine by itself, you will need to decrease intensiveness. So if you want a higher volume, don't go anywhere close to failure. If you want to do high volume, include more machine work in your workout. I'm not saying do only machines. I still recommend doing at least one big basic barbell lift for each muscle group. But the assistance work, if you're natural and you want to do high volume, you might need to go with more machine or cable work. If you want to do strictly free weights, then you might need to lower that volume down a bit. If you are the kind of guy who likes to take your sets to failure and beyond, using rest pauses, stuff like that, well, you're going to need to lower your training volume to allow yourself to do that. That's what I mean by lowering training stress. You pick one of the three most important variables. So that could be volume, intensiveness, psychological stress, or heavy lifting or CrossFit type workout. And you emphasize one per training block or one per session. The other two ones are lowered. Then you use the remaining three variables to play around to make sure that you are increasing or decreasing training stress depending on what you want to accomplish. Might require a higher training frequency per body part than an enhanced lifter. The reason is, as I mentioned, your protein synthesis will be elevated in a muscle for up to 36 hours. So for maximum, you only have a day and a half of maximum growth. If you hit a muscle twice a week, you do get more protein synthesis in that muscle. So dividing the volume in 2 sessions during the week for a body part is likely going to be a bit more effective for natural trainees. That you can still have a bit volume. You don't need to have, like, if you're doing like 15 sets or 14 sets once a week, you don't need to go 7 sets. You could do 10 sets, for example. It can be slightly higher, but not 14. You still need to decrease. The overall training volume per week should be fairly similar, with like a 20% range if you train a muscle one time, 2 times, or 3 times a week. However, natural trainees probably should not increase overall training frequency, because every time you train, you're increasing cortisol. And if you want to train each muscle twice a week or 3 times a week, you're going to have to do more muscle groups in a session, meaning more exercises likely. So total volume might be high per session. So you can't train 7 days a week like that, okay? So you might actually need to decrease overall training frequency while increasing body part frequency, either by using a whole body approach or an upper-lower split or push-pull split. The way I use push-pull with most clients is I actually do quads on the push workouts and hamstrings on the pull workout. So push would be chest, delts, triceps, quads. Pull would be back, hamstrings, biceps, traps, or brachialis, something like that. Natural trainee can more safely focus on progressive overload, trying to gradually add weight to the bar, add weight to the bar, add weight to the bar. Enhanced lifters actually don't need to be that much focused on progressive overload. They can actually grow simply by training a muscle hard, not trying to add weight every session, okay? And if they focus too much on progressive overload, because their strength goes up so fast, they might actually increase load too much from week to week. If an enhanced lifter wants to use progressive overload, that's fine, but they should not add the most weight they can every week. If they're capable of adding 30 pounds per week, maybe only add 15 pounds, so that the load will not eventually exceed what the tendon can handle safely. Natural trainee will benefit more than enhanced lifter from planned deloading weeks. So every 4 to 6 weeks, you would dramatically decrease training stress by around 50%. That could be by decreasing volume, decreasing intensiveness, decreasing psychological stress. Any of the 6 variables we saw earlier can be used to deload. The goal is not to decrease volume. The goal is to decrease overall training stress. So for example, if on my program I did only big basic lifts with a free weight, well, if the next week I keep the same volume, but I only do machine exercises, that's a deload because I decrease the neurological stress. If I keep the same volume, but instead of going 1 rep to failure, I go 3 reps to failure, that's a deload. So any of the 6 variables or a combination of those 6 variables can be used to deload. And really, unless you're competing for a strength competition, it really doesn't matter which of those variables you use to deload, as long as you're decreasing overall training stress. So natural trainees will benefit more from a deload than enhanced lifters because they need to make sure that they never reach that excess cortisol level. Enhanced lifters can benefit from a higher daily volume and also causing more muscle damage. In fact, enhanced lifters will respond quite well to what I call a muscle bombing approach. So on one training day, you train 1 or 2 muscles and you do a boatload of sets for that muscle using advanced technique, whatever, just making sure you're killing that muscle, and then you're not training it for the rest of the week. For an enhanced lifter, that works really well, because even if they're causing too much damage that they could normally recover from in that 36 hours period, doesn't matter. They have the whole week to rebuild, because of they will always be at an elevated and a protein synthesis state. So with the stronger lifters, those who are naturally built for strength, thicker tendons, bigger joints, stuff like that, they can still lift for strength. But someone who's built normally and goes on steroids, especially for an ectomorph, like small joints and stuff, or more lanky in stature, they need to be more conservative when it comes to progressing in weights in the gym when they train for strength, because they will be able to gain strength too fast for their tendons to support it. So you need to take that in mind. Now, it's a mistake, as you probably have concluded for yourself, that it's a mistake for most natural trainees to follow the training program of an enhanced lifter, okay? Unless they're genetically gifted. By the way, some enhanced lifters actually train very smart. They actually do low volume. An example I want to mention afterwards, Dr. Scott Stevenson, competitive bodybuilder, who developed fortitude training, very low volume. Now, if I were to design the optimal way a natural trainee should train for hypertrophy, fortitude training would be pretty darn close to that, right? But it's done by a lot of enhanced bodybuilders. So you can actually look at that, and that even though he is enhanced, or lifters who are enhanced or using that program, that's actually a very good plan for a natural trainee. The way Dorian Yates trained was pretty good for a natural trainee, even though he was enhanced. The way Mike Menzer trained during his peak, not the heavy duty shit of 1 set per body part per month or something like that. The way he actually trained was pretty good. So even though he was enhanced, the way he trained was effective for natural training. What I'm talking about is those doing 6 exercises per body part, tons of sets, tons of drop sets, supersets, stuff like that. Well, you can't recover from that. It might look cool on Instagram, but it will not make you grow. It might work for a week or two until you are caught up by excess cortisol levels and excessive muscle damage. However, the opposite is not true. What is optimal for a natural trainee could actually work very well for an enhanced lifter. Case in point, fortitude training, as I mentioned earlier, Dorian Yates with low volume training, stuff like that. Now, potential issues with enhanced training. Besides the obvious health issue, because they are real, right? It is possible to use steroids safely if you're smart about it, and if you have the genetics for it. The thing is that many people actually have bad genetics to tolerate steroids, and they don't know about it. Blood pressure would be too high, which can damage the kidney. Cholesterol profile will be out of whack. Blood lipids will be out of whack. All things you don't see, but down the line can lead to an increased risk of cardiovascular issues, sexual problems, kidney issues, stuff like that. So these are very real. And just because, well, no, nothing ever happened to me. Well, not right now, but it's quite possible that in the future you're going to have some. And you know what? No bodybuilder will actually talk about those problems. Yeah, I haven't been able to fuck my wife for 3 years. Nobody's going to be telling you that, right? So you don't know. And these health issues are real. But besides that, there are actual problems when it comes especially to post-cycle, okay? First, I mentioned that earlier, you overstimulate the dopamine receptors when you're taking steroids. That's even worse if you're smoking, because smoking also targets the dopamine receptors. And that can lead to desensitization of the dopamine receptors because you overstimulate them, and leads to withdrawal after the cycle. That can lead to depression and addiction. Because it's not just, well, I'm getting smaller, I need to get big. You actually have an overall sense of feeling like shit, feeling depressed when you go off. And that's very real. It's not you being weak. It's just your dopamine response is out of whack. A lot of bodybuilders will actually start eating like shit when they're off cycle, while to get that dopamine response. Their body subconsciously tell them, well, you know what? If you eat that box of cake, I'm going to give you a pleasure response, bro. So they do that to get what they were lacking from taking the steroids out of their regimen. And the other issues is the cortisol rebound. And that's the important point. Because when a steroid user is on cycle, okay, he is protected in large part at the muscle level from excess cortisol, okay? However, that's actually like taking a loan from the bank. It's very cool. You have a lot more money to spend, more volume, more training stress. And with that money, I can actually make more gains, more financial gains or more muscle gains. But eventually, I'm going to have to pay that loan back. And that's post-cycle. So post-cycle, what happens is, if you overproduce cortisol during your cycle, during the cycle, you start producing more cortisol because you're training more, using more advanced techniques, stuff like that. But because you're flooding your body with androgens, it can block the activity of cortisol by decreasing second messengers, for example. Well, the body can adjust to that. So at first, what it will do, it will actually start pumping out more cortisol to try to compete with the androgens, because the body still needs cortisol to do its job. It's a matter of survival. So if it senses it can't do it properly, it will just pump out more cortisol in response to the same action. Okay? But you know what? You're still protected. So you're still fine. Normally, that's like in the middle of a cycle, your gain starts to slow down. That's because the body is trying to balance things out by pumping out more cortisol. If you continue, oftentimes people will actually increase their dosages at that point. And when the body will try a second strategy, it will make those glucocorticoid or cortisol receptors more sensitive to try once again to compete with the androgen overstimulation. And that's normally when you hit a plateau in your cycle. And if you continue, maybe increasing the dosage, what happens is you can actually increase the number of glucocorticoid or cortisol receptors. Once again, trying to even things out. As long as you're on high dosage of steroids, that's not a problem. It will prevent you from adding lots of muscle unless you keep piling on the dosage, but at least you're not going to lose muscle. But when you go off cycle, what happens? If you took it to the limit, you have more glucocorticoid or cortisol receptors. They are more sensitive to cortisol, and you're pumping out more cortisol, and now you don't have the androgens to compensate. That's why you lose muscle. A steroid user who goes off cycle doesn't lose muscle because his testosterone production stopped. That doesn't help. It slows down muscle growth, but you can actually gain muscle with zero testosterone. Lack of testosterone cannot make you lose muscle. Excess cortisol can make you lose muscle. So the benefits you get from steroids during your cycle can be your downfall when you stop your cycle. That's why you see so many of these bodybuilders, especially on Instagram, they are on steroids year-round, the blast and cruise approach, because they're afraid of losing their gains. Because the more aggressive they are with their dosages, and also the training volume they can do by being on, the bigger the rebound they will get afterwards, and the more muscle they lose. They freak out. Dude, if my biceps are smaller, I'm going to lose followers. So they stay on all the time. That's what happens. Okay? Cortisol is your enemy, whether you're natural or enhanced. But if you're enhanced, it just shows up at your door when you take your guard down and you go off cycle. So that is my presentation for today. Sorry for the glitches in the beginning. If you liked it and you want me to do more, please subscribe. If you were able to survive the whole hour and 20 minutes, I'm taking my hat off to you because you're more patient than I am. So thank you for listening. Be sure to visit Thibarmy at thibarmy.com. Also, you can look at my Instagram feed on still Thibarmy, and I hope to see you in the future. So I welcome all the haters because any comment will boost my algorithm. On that positive thought, have a good day.